Hi, my name is Katherine Schweit. I am a retired FBI agent, but before I was a retired FBI agent, I was a regular old citizen in Michigan and Chicago. I worked as a journalist and then joined the law world when I became a prosecutor in Chicago. Then moved on to the FBI. I did 20 years as an FBI special agent before I mandatory retired, and moved into kind of the private practice world, and then into so many other things like books and podcasts and things I never would have imagined doing. So I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and my family moved, a little ways away from there for when my dad got a job transfer. But I came from a big Irish Catholic family, and so there were 10 of us. My mom's family was from Canada, via Canada and Ireland, and the Muldoons, as they were. And then my dad's family was from France, the Davidroys, and so they came through the St. Louis area in the United States. So we're very, French Irish Catholic world, and we kind of grew up what you'd just expect, church on Sundays and blah blah blah, and hard work ethic. And I think that kind of instilled in me early on that you get what you work for. And so I went to so I started working when I was 18, and a real job, and while I was going to college, and that real job was at a local newspaper. And so it really kind of solidified that that's really what I wanted to do. So I was going to be a journalist for the whole rest of my life. So I went to school at Michigan State University to get a bachelor's degree and continued to work in the newspaper industry for a long time until I moved, and it took me to Chicago, which is my favorite city in the world, but maybe I need to visit more cities, but I'm just trusting me. It's the food and the people, the social, the everything. It's wonderful. So I moved to Chicago and got a law degree and practiced law there. But that's really what led me to the FBI, because my cousin was an agent at the FBI at the time, and he said, we need lawyers and women in the FBI. We don't have enough of them. You should come in. And that's what started my journey into the FBI.
So you went into the FBI as a lawyer. That was your first step. So what was that process like? Tell us about how it happened and training.
So in the FBI, everybody comes in as an agent candidate, just as a person, as an agent, and they hire older. They don't hire right out of college. They hire, and the average age at the academy when I was FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, the average age when I was there was 30. It's very similar to that now. So 30, and at the academy, everybody learns to be an agent. There's kind of a phrase like an agent is an agent is an agent. And you have to be able to do espionage cases, and you have to be able to do drug cases, and you have to be able to do, bank robberies, and you have to be able to do all the kinds of cases that the FBI might be responsible for, political corruption cases, domestic terrorist cases. So we all did that on a regular basis. We did all the stuff that we do, and I trained for that at the FBI Academy. So even though I was a lawyer, there were plenty of other lawyers who came into the academy. In my class, there were engineers and scientists and military people, soldiers, pilots, school teacher. I sat next to a third grade school teacher from Philadelphia. But when you're an FBI agent, you become an agent, and you have to learn how to do everything. And that includes rolling people's fingerprints and dusting for prints on glass and on styrofoam, and bagging evidence and digging things up if you need to, and interviewing people and handcuffing people and learning how to box. And it's a whole all-encompassing process.
How long are you actually in training?
I was in training for 20 weeks, which was a challenge because I am a single mom with 2 kids, but that's a story for a different day. But 20 weeks of training, and it's varied through the years. It depends on how much else they're trying to teach you, because I mentioned all those I mentioned all this of some of the things that we did, but the other things that we do, which you would expect, is we learn how to proficiently handle a gun, break it down, troubleshoot it. Because training FBI agents carry guns, so it's important that they know how to use them, and protect themselves, but also protect others from it. And also, I would mention that the largest block of training that we receive as an FBI agent candidate is ethics, and I'm kind of proud of that. That more than anything else, law enforcement has to know what's the right thing to do, and I think you get that with the ethics of what you in the training that you learn in the FBI. I just saw some research the other day that was, just released information on an Associated Press story where they had done this research about law enforcement killing and injuring people with firearms. And because, of course, in the States here, that's an issue, that's a concern too, that we're trying to reduce firearms deaths and injuries. Those include firearm deaths and injuries that might occur because law enforcement's called to the scene and then there's a gun there. And the story said that policies and procedures, and you think about this, we have a lot of policies and procedures for when law enforcement should pull a gun and fire the gun and things like that. And it's called essentially a deadly force policy. That's what it's called, deadly force policy. When can you use deadly force? The research showed, however, that 30% of the time, the killings that law enforcement ended up engaged in, 30% of the time, law enforcement did not follow policy and procedure in order to save a life. So I don't know if I'm saying that right, but they found all these different times when law enforcement maybe potentially violated a policy or procedure or didn't respond as well as they could have, and that accounted for some of these deaths. But in 30% of the deaths, it was because law enforcement knew what to do to save lives and knew it was more important to violate policies and procedures to protect life. And I think that really speaks to two things. One, what the training that I got at the FBI, the training that law enforcement gets hopefully everywhere, and they remember every day, is that it's guidelines, but that they have to use, it's more important that they apply that to the situation and understand that doing the right thing, which is what ethics is, right? Doing the right thing is always the right answer, even if it means you get in trouble for violating policies and procedures, or you lose your job or whatever. It's more important because you can't, especially with a firearm, you can't take that back. And I mean, the firearm's the most extreme, but in any instance, if you interrogate somebody and you get a confession out of them, but you do it by pushing them around, bullying them, or threatening them in a way that's unethical, you can't do that. And so I think that ethics is the underlying. We count on law enforcement above all to be above the standards that everybody else might set for ethics. So that is very important to me.
No, I can tell, and it is important. And do you know if, I mean, obviously you said that you had that ethics training in your training. Do you know if all law enforcement officers in the United States get the same kind of training, or is it varied?
I think the FBI is fortunate because it is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It is the largest, federal law enforcement agency with agents working in this in the types of cases that we work. We work all the cases. There is a organization that handles, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, ATF. There's an organization that handles drugs, the DEA, right? Drug Enforcement Administration. But the FBI handles all of those. And so I think that all of those crimes that we investigate too. So I think, have an overriding responsibility. And I think that we have been given opportunities to get overridingly high quality training that I don't think is afforded all of law enforcement. We have maybe 700, 800,000 law enforcement agents, officers in the United States. And they are all getting trained by different people and different standards. And there are tremendous programs out there, but not everybody gets that. Not only gets that, but gets kind of retrained in it, reminded of it. And the Bureau has been fortunate through their 100+ years to be able to hire, a handpick in a time when law enforcement right now in the United States they're looking for 50 potential law enforcement officers, and they have 40 applicants, right? In the FBI, we hire, in classes of maybe 50 or 40. In a given year, we might bring 800 or more special agents online, but we have 30,000 plus applicants for those. So we have a high bar to pick from in terms of the people who are there. And local law enforcement doesn't always have that. State and tribal local law enforcement doesn't always have that luxury. And so actually that kind of makes that kind of base training more important, but I don't know that they have the money all the time to give that kind of good training, which is unfortunate.
So what is it then like when you have to work with law enforcement?
I think it's arrogant, right, for the FBI to think that we're highbrow, right? We can't and we shouldn't think that ever. Federal law enforcement's no better than state, no better than local, no better than tribal. Every agency has its own requirements. It's different than in other countries. My companion, officials, law enforcement officials, like in London, who I deal with, they have in many countries they have a regular pour down. They're all kind of one national. They're one policing system that runs from the national down to the very local level. And in the United States, it doesn't work that way, and it makes it more of a challenge. You have to appreciate when you go out as an FBI agent that you may be the only FBI agent. I've been this plenty of times, the only FBI agent, in the county at that moment, and that there are state police officers who are highly trained in what they do, county police, county sheriffs who are highly trained in what they do, local officers. And the thing about it is, it's the same thing. You think about like a local officer or a school resource officer who just works in an elementary school or something. They know their environment in a way that you will never know it. Our responsibilities in the FBI is so broad. Even when I worked in one of our smaller offices, I was responsible for, 2 or 3 counties. So that's 30, 40 square miles. And I can't know the community the way a local officer knows it. So a federal officer who comes to an environment of law enforcement and thinks that they know more because they're federal, it just means they're dumb. They're going to get kicked. You know what I'm saying? They don't know more. They have to appreciate that everybody comes to the table with different tools that we can put in the toolbox to solve the crime or resolve the issues that are in front of us. And that's the most important thing you have to remember, I think, as a federal law enforcement officer, is that you bring tools that other people don't have, and they have tools you don't have.
So before you joined the FBI, you were a prosecutor. Was that right?
So before I joined the FBI, I had not planned at all to be in the FBI. And I was planning on continuing as a journalist. And even when I went to law school, I planned on using that law background as a journalist. But I did get offered a job that paid a lot more, and journalism doesn't pay a lot. Writing in the newspaper world doesn't pay a lot. So I took a job with a judge who was an appellate judge, the like middle level of the court systems here. And then she passed away, and the local prosecutor's office said, we move over here. We've got a job for you. Yeah, so it was wonderful. But the local prosecutor's office is, in fact, the largest court system in the United States. It's Cook County in Chicago. And so I became a prosecutor in Chicago, managing all the drug cases on appeal, on appeal. So that was, I loved that job. And I argued a lot of cases in front of the appellate and I one in front of the Supreme Court. And that was really fun. And I would have probably stayed there, but it's also more politically oriented kind of jobs. And, the state's attorney is an elected position and they change every year. And so it was a little bit of less stability for where I'd be working. And because it's the largest court system in the United States, they have 5 major courthouses spread out over, I don't know, 35 miles or something, or maybe it's less in Chicago, but it's a huge area. And if you get transferred on a Friday from the northern courthouse where I was working to the southern courthouse, it's like 2 hours away. You have to move. And I was raising two kids by myself. I couldn't afford to move. And so I knew I had to change, not because I didn't love prosecuting, but because I needed to have a more stable environment. And the FBI, as it surprised me, I found out that that was better.
And did that job as a prosecutor, did it transfer? Did it help you when you went into the FBI?
Yeah, being a prosecutor gave me such an incredible foundation for being an FBI agent because I worked in the appellate level, which means that after the trial court, happens and somebody gets convicted or somebody can't get convicted because we can't push the case forward, the stuff would come into my desk. And so often I was managing all these younger attorneys, and I would be trying to present arguments to appellate judges and justices, and they would say to me, why didn't the police officer do this? Why didn't the police officer do that? Why didn't the prosecutor at the trial court level do this? Why didn't they do that? And I learned all the things that can go wrong when you don't put things the right way in the very beginning. The tiniest cases that become the biggest cases in front of the US Supreme Court all started out with a police encounter with some idiot who, gets arrested because he's doing something wrong. And those tiny little cases, Miranda is a word that's really popular. If you look back at the Miranda is your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Every television show tells you that, right? You have the right to remain silent. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. It's all these handful of rights. Those Miranda is a guy who was an idiot who was arrested, and then in fact he got off. He got out of jail because of that charge, and then he got arrested later.
Yeah.
So it's like but that idea of learning and working in the appellate court process and then in the prosecutor's office gave me a fantastic foundation to understand that everything I do as an agent, when it comes to interrogating somebody, investigating somebody, writing a piece of paper, every bit of it could end up, in the Supreme Court or creating law.
So tell me a little bit about what department you were in.
Everybody in the FBI starts out as an agent, right? So you get assigned someplace, you don't even know where you're going to get assigned. The United States is a pretty big country. They say, where would you like to be assigned? And then they just sign you wherever they want to assign you, where they need the body. And so that's the reality of it. So I got assigned to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to a national security squad. And I had been doing all drug cases in the prosecutor's office. And I went to the FBI, and suddenly I had to learn about international and domestic terrorism. And that was my whole world. I had to learn that. And that includes like espionage cases and people who are spying for other countries, people who are in our country trying to spy, and people who are in our country, residents here, but are trying to terrorize people in our own country for their own political purposes, right? Domestic terrorism. And all countries have that. And the United States has a lot of threats of international terrorism because the United States is lucrative in lots of ways. It's a big, open, porous location, unlike some other countries. And we have things that people want to steal. We have business secrets, and we have politicians who they want to bribe to get tariff laws that work in their favor. And so I was working national security cases, and that meant espionage cases, and I worked Hamas cases and Sikh the Sikh issues in India and Pakistan, and cases like that. But I also worked in what we call our resident agency. It's one of our smaller offices. The FBI has 56 field offices, but also has about 500 smaller offices that are local satellite offices. And when you get assigned to one of those, you do whatever walks in the door or whatever you get a call for. So because of that, I worked a lot of bank robberies, and I worked a lot of fraud cases, insurance fraud, somebody who felt like they were being cheated by somebody, but they couldn't, the local police couldn't do anything about it because, the subject had fled to another state and stuff like that. So you kind of learn the whole gamut of everything you can work on. And I did that for a number of years. And then the September 11th terrorist attacks occurred in the United States, and that kind of changed the trajectory of my career.
Where did that lead you then?
So in September in 2001, we had planes that hit our Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and a fourth one that went into the fields in Pennsylvania. And I was working as the acting terrorism supervisor for our Milwaukee office, which covered the state of Wisconsin. So suddenly I was propelled into this position that I needed to manage all of the terrorism aspects of terrorism case aspects for the state of Wisconsin, which is one of our smaller offices, but nonetheless, I was in an acting position. It wasn't even assigned to me until the boss said, we need you to do this for a while, and you do whatever you're told to do. So that was kind of a prescient for me. So that was a very intense job. It took a tremendous amount of time. Every day that I was in the office on the weekends, the kids were with me. I had little kids, and they were with me sitting in my tiny little office because they had to. I would say to them, get in the car, get your homework, get your coloring books, bring a board game, come and sit in my office. We're gonna be there all day, and we'd be there for 12 hours and work. And I think that my kids learned to do whatever it takes to do during that time too. They understood that there were things, even at very young ages, they came to quickly understand that there are things in life that are a lot bigger than their desires, and I think that reflects in how they who they grew up to be, which I'm proud of. But then, because of that position, I was working in that position pretty much night and day. I had a lot of experience, and then I was promoted into Washington, D.C. And so I moved with the kids to Washington, D.C. I think, because I had that experience and that exposure. And so I moved in to work in what we call counterintelligence, but it's kind of like espionage cases and things like that in Washington, D.C. And worked in Washington and on a number of different things for a number of years. But then I suddenly hit another big fissure in my career and had to jump the gorge after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, where 20 children were killed and 6 women by a young gunman who came through the front door of the school in Connecticut.
I'm curious. You mentioned your children as they've grown up with you, and at the time when at the 9/11 they were in the office with you all that time. What was it like for them growing up with you in the FBI?
I can tell you that neither of them want to be in the FBI. I think, I think they're both hardworking kids, but I think that they recognize that the FBI is a full-time job, and it's your family's in the job too. Kind of like you think of somebody in the military. You can't. My mother, God rest her soul, was moving during 9/11 out of the house I grew up in. And we went to her new house about 5 months after, or so, about 5 months after 9/11. My mom was moving, and it was the first time I'd been able to leave to visit family, where things were calm enough that I could leave to visit family. And so we went to visit, and we went because my mom was moving, and I have all these siblings. We went to paint her house in one day. So we painted the interior of her new house in one day. And, it just took all that time. And my mom, the whole time, I was getting pages, because we carried pagers back then. I was getting pages from the office with questions and decisions I had to make. And my mom kept saying, don't they know you're with your family? You're on vacation. You shouldn't have to take any calls. It's like she just didn't quite understand that that's part of my job. The job is a 24-hour job, and the kids came to understand that. I had a source once who was young and confused and troubled and stuff, and he would call at night, and sometimes he would call and say, "I can't. My mom's already asleep, but I need to talk to somebody." He just needed. He was just really a misguided young kid, and he was involved with some really bad people, and I was trying to get him. I was getting information about the bad people from him, but also I was trying to get him into a better spot. He was a young man, but he had a 5-year-old child. And one time when I was on the phone, you're getting up from the middle of dinner because you got to take a call and stuff like that. And one time, one of my kids said to me, is that young kid that calls you all the time, Mom? And I said, yeah, it is. So I think the kids got it. The kids get that it was a full-time job. So people would say to them, oh, are you going to go into the FBI? And my kids would be like, no, when that's not happening. That's not happening. And not because they're not dedicated, but I think because they know the toll that it took on our time. And also, it's time demanding, it's exhausting sometimes, and you're not in charge of all the time. So you're either in or you're not. And that's the important part, I think, about being an FBI agent. You've got to be in, you've got to set your standards high, and you got to stay there.
Wow.
So the kids understood that. So they carried that into their lives and their worlds. And I see that. And I will tell you one funny story about my younger daughter. She's a singer. She owns her own music studio, which she bought and set up when she was in her mid-20s.
Oh.
So not a slow rider there. And when she was young and we moved to Washington, she came home one day and she said, and of course she'd changed schools, and she came home one day from school and she said, I'm so disappointed and she named some kid in school. And I said, well, why? What happened? Because the teacher said, when we were taking a spelling test, the teacher said, put your pencil down. And I could see he wrote like 3 or 4 more letters. She was so offended that he had violated the rules. So my kids definitely know that there are rules, but they also, I think, have the compassion that comes with understanding that sometimes you just have to do the right things. And that I think more than anything, that we're so much more fortunate than so many other people. And you have to look out for, the people around you because they were raised in a really fortunate manner by somebody who had a steady job and good health insurance and a home. And I think they came to recognize in the interactions and the people that I dealt with that, they were the exception sometimes, not the rule. I don't want you to think I'm drinking a beer, so I'm just going to let you know. Sorry about the noise. For the listeners, sorry about that. I just wanted to drink a little, as we would call it, pop here in the Midwest. In the East Coast, they call it soda. I don't know what they call it where you are.
You mentioned in the story that you used to carry pagers with you back then.
Yeah, that's dating myself. I'm dating myself.
But I was wondering, can you talk about what else you carried at that time?
So when I became an agent, I already had kids. And so I knew that they needed to understand my job from a safety standpoint, because FBI agents don't just carry handguns. We have rifles and we have shotguns and we have bullets around the house. And I had a bulletproof vests and undercover vests and handcuffs and terrible black dust for taking fingerprints that never goes away if you spill it, but all kinds of things like that pepper spray, things that potentially, are kind of a challenge. You have to have these things with you all the time, but understand we didn't carry tasers, but these lethality, particularly of firearms, was to me. I didn't grow up shooting guns. I had cousins who were in the country, and they did. I grew up in Michigan, where a lot of people hunted, but we particularly didn't. My parents didn't. So we didn't particularly have firearms around the house. And I felt it was very important. To me, they were kind of a mystery as a kid. We'd go to my cousin's house and the guns would be on the gun rack, or they'd be in the case or something. And occasionally there might be shooting, BBs at something, pop cans or something on the fence. But I didn't know anything about it. So when I went to the academy and I learned about guns, and then I knew I was going to have guns at home, I knew I needed to teach my kids some basics about guns. And so my kids learned to shoot, which they didn't particularly find fun. They learned about guns, but, and I wanted to expose them to understand how to keep themselves safe. I think that's important. Something, in the United States, we have more guns than we've ever had before. We have more guns than people. And it's important that everybody understand gun safety, not because we want everybody to carry a gun or have a gun, but because there are so many guns around. And it would not be unheard of for somebody whose child, I didn't want my children to go to somebody's house where there was a gun, and an 8-year-old found it fascinating at that house, pulled the gun out, and then my child could be killed or that child could be killed. But my children knowing about the dangers of guns and appreciating how to never point the gun at a person ever, whether it's loaded or not, right? You never point a gun. It drives me crazy when I see something in the movies or television where they point the gun at the screen. I'm like, don't do that. Just don't do that. There's no reason ever to point a gun at somebody, even in pretend. And so I wanted my kids to learn that. I wanted my kids to understand, the difference between what a rifle is and what a shotgun is. And I actually didn't keep, the FBI has a lot of rules about how, if you take a gun home from the FBI, a rifle or a shotgun, a long gun, it has to be locked in certain ways. And so there's a lot of rules and regulations because they don't want to have those kinds of accidents. But handguns are tricky, and there's a lot of them, right? More guns in the United States are handguns than anything else. And it's easy for a kid to pick that up or think it's a toy because we have toy guns in the United States, more than probably maybe some other countries. So I wanted to make sure they knew how to do that. And I remember when one of my kids was younger and said, "I need your gun safe combination. I need the combination to your gun safe in case you're not here, and I need to defend myself in case some bad guy comes into the house." And I said, "No, you don't." And my kid was like, "No, I do, because what if something bad happens?" And I said, "No, you don't. Bringing a gun is just bringing a gun to the gunfight. You're never going to need to have access to my guns, and there's more likely a problem that it's going to happen. There's going to be a problem then. More kids are killed with guns at home than anywhere else, 5 times as likely as in school to be killed." So all these facts that I learned, through the years, and that I came to understand particularly in the last 10 years about firearms and firearm safety, my kids were kind of learning on the run with me. When the children and the women were killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, there was not surprisingly astonishing, outrage in the United States and a condemning desire to get something done. And President Obama was the president at the time. He tasked his then Vice President Joe Biden, who's our president now. Joe Biden was tasked with putting together a handful of federal agency executives to find some answers. And I apparently was like walking down the hallway the wrong way or something one day at FBI headquarters. And so I became the person for the FBI. So I went to join a team at the White House from several, a handful of people from several departments that are the executive in the United States is responsible for our departments like the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services. So those types of departments, an executive from these handful of departments came together with somebody from Department of Homeland Security, which owns FEMA. FEMA is our preparedness organization in the United States. So there were a handful of us that met every day after Sandy Hook, every day. And all we did every day was argue about what do we know? What do we need to learn better? How do we need to learn? Whether it was about, how to keep kids safe in a school, or how to prevent somebody who's thinking of getting guns from shooting a school up or shooting a business up. So we had to really kind of start from scratch because nobody had really ever looked at the whole thing in a comprehensive way before. And I think that's what the team was doing. So that's pretty much where we started. And that was after the Sandy Hook massacre in 2012. That was December of 2012. And by January of 13, we were meeting every day in the Department of Education building or in the White House Executive Office building, the EEOB, they call it, behind the White House. That's the one you see all the time in the pictures. There's another big building there where lots of offices are, including the Vice President's office. And we would meet there every day and just try to talk and argue and talk about what to do. And then we came up with some plans. We came up with some ideas. So that's kind of where what got us there. So what came out of that are things that people might know now. The FBI has research from there's a FBI research called A Study of Active Shooters from 2000 to 2013. It's a study of 160 active shooters. It was the first time we'd ever looked at these types of shootings like occurred in the schools and the malls and the movie theaters. No one had ever taken police reports and then gathered the data from those police reports. The FBI did that. So that study became kind of the seminal research. And I co-wrote that study. My team put that together at the FBI. But then from an organizational standpoint, this team at the White House, we also put together and agreed to push out standardized plans and to help, whether you're a school or a house of worship, a college, a business, a place of business, how to develop your emergency plans. Because a lot of course, schools and places and business would have emergency plans, like in case of a tornado, or in case of a fire, or in case of a tsunami or a hurricane. But very rarely did any of those plans just incorporate in them the more dramatic, traumatic situation of planning in case somebody comes into your building shooting, or there's a violent act, a criminal act. Emergency planning didn't include criminal activity anticipation before. And so we worked on plans to say, you need to, if you're going to have a plan for your school, which is required by federal law to get federal funds, your plan has to include a plan for emergencies that might involve shootings. So that was another thing. It's lots of words, but it's very practical. I'll explain why. The second thing, we did a third thing. We pushed out what you may have heard of now as Run, Hide, Fight. Run, Hide, Fight it was a brand new idea from the city of Houston, Texas. Their mayor's office had developed it, and I called the mayor's office and said, I want this to be the national message. I want this to be the national message. I don't want to have any more. Right now, we have 17 different messages coming from different organizations. Some of them are private. Some of them are for-profit organizations, and they want you to follow their mantra because they can make money doing it. We're not going to do that. The federal government's going to push out a single message so that everybody can understand it. It's in simple language. It's offered in like 15 languages or something like that. Maybe it's 9. But whatever they needed in Houston, like it's offered in English and Spanish and Portuguese and Chinese and Japanese and Korean, and so all these different languages. So it's already done. It's already available. So we pushed out this Run, Hide, Fight training. And then the fourth thing I would mention is we trained 300 of the FBI's tactical special agents, who are tactically trained officers, the kind who run into buildings, what you think of as SWAT teams, and we trained 300 of our tactical officers so they could spread out in the United States in their own communities and train thousands and thousands and thousands of local police in what to do if they got a call that there was a shooting underway. And so that dynamic police response. So I think those were the things that at the White House level we talked about. A lot of them really had to do with the FBI helping police do a better job with what they had to face. But then also we gathered a tremendous amount of after action reports, a lot of research on incidents that already occurred, and we found out what went wrong. And that helped us to develop a whole set of what you should do right, the best practices. So that's pretty much been my life for the last 10 plus years.
What about getting it disseminated between schools and colleges? How did you not enforce it, but help them?
I think it's great to have plans and policies, right? It's great to have best practices. But if somebody doesn't take that and incorporate it into their little school district in the middle of Montana, or your town of 300 in Texas, it doesn't do any good. And I think that's always been the challenge, and that's why I'm still in the game, even though I got to a mandatory age requirement for the FBI, and in 2017 I had to retire. But I just really couldn't walk away because I felt like even though we had come up with a lot of best practices and we'd come up with a lot of good training, and we thought how we could slow down the shootings, reduce the number of people injured and killed, shorten the time for law enforcement to get to the scene, we still didn't have the people who were going to be impacted, the school children and the parents and the business owners. We just didn't, they still don't think it will ever happen. Or they don't have time. They're so busy trying to keep their business afloat or their kids at school. They don't have time to think about it. So until it happens, they don't think about it. And that's the hard part for me is I need to keep it up in everybody's face, so to speak, and say, you need to be prepared for this.
How did it feel when you'd left? What was it like the day after? And then what did you feel you needed to carry on doing?
Well, nobody's ever asked me what it was like after I left the FBI. So I left the FBI knowing, because of my age, exactly when I was going to have to leave. Some people don't know when they're going to leave their job. I knew exactly when I had to leave. I had to leave on the last day of July in 2017. And I knew that 20 years in, right? I knew that my entire FBI career. So I kind of planned for it, and I knew I'd have to have some plans in place. Where I was working on what I felt was something super important at the FBI, and I didn't want it to be left to chance. So I managed people into positions. I trained them to do what I was doing. I groomed the successors. So I felt like when I left the building, that would be good. And then when I left the building, it would be more about, well, what's my situation and how can I protect myself? So I determined that I was going to every morning get up and walk 5 miles. I know, no kidding. I don't know how I came up with 5 miles, but I just did. So I'm like, every morning I'm going to get up and I'm going to walk 5 miles. So I feel like I accomplished something. And I was not a 5-mile walker. So that was a big challenge. But I am now. And so I'd get up every morning and I'd walk 5 miles. And then I came back home and I started writing a book. And I was working on, because I'm a writer in my head, right? I was always a journalist. I was always a writer. And I was writing this book that had to do with the history of the FBI's in the eyes of the public, their reputation, kind of. And I was working on this book, but shootings would happen, and I would continually get calls from people to say, "Could you come here and speak? Could you do this news interview? Could I have you on my podcast? Could I?" And then a shooting would happen, and then I'd be like pulled away from working on the book. So my book agent said, "Can you just write all that stuff that's in your head in a book so it can go away and you can go back to writing what you want to write?" So foolishly, I thought that was a good idea. Mm-hmm. So I wrote my first book, which was called Stop the Killing: How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis. And I thought that if I wrote that book, everybody would read it, everybody would incorporate and understand everything we were trying to teach them, and then the world would be a beautiful place.
What really happened?
And it was almost like that. Yeah. Did not really happen. So what happened is then I started getting more calls, and people would say, "Oh, you're the mass shooting expert. We need your counsel on this crisis that's going on. We need your advice on this. We want this is a shooting that's underway. We want to talk to you about what's going on with law enforcement, what's going on, what are the school district doing, what should they be doing? What is the place of business doing? What is the business corporate model for security that isn't there, that should be?" And so I suddenly became a security consulting, specializing in this. I was making speeches, and I was talking to people. I was being flown to places to talk to people and groups of school district officials and advise really top tier Fortune 100 companies and their security departments about what was missing on their communications plans and in their training for their security people, or all these different things. And so I really kind of got sucked down to that rabbit hole of, I felt like I really needed to continue to help support schools and businesses, in particular houses of worship. So that's where I am, and that's what I still do. And I still see things like, after I released that book, I released a new edition of it the next year, just in 2023, at the same time that I wrote a book called How to Talk About Guns with Anyone, because I wanted that book, because people are so often afraid of guns, and they don't understand them, and they don't understand any of the federal or local laws. And I don't mean all people are that way, but I would bet that there are very few people who could read this very small book and not find 10 things that they don't know about, even if they're gun owners, even if they're regularly working in the gun industry issues. I mean, there's so much so much out there that people misunderstand. It's more that you think you know this about this gun law and you're wrong. I mean, because nobody ever told you otherwise. So that's why I wrote the book. So, I mean, I'm still just advocating for let's reduce firearms violence in any way we can. And that's what I do like every day, which is really what led me to my own podcast. I had no interest in doing a podcast, as you might anticipate, since I was already writing and consulting, and I was trying to get back to the fun writing, which I'm back to a little bit right now, I'm proud to say. I'm almost done with a fun book. It's still about dead people, but it's a fun book. Trust me, you're going to think it's a fun book. I'll let you read it ahead of time. But Sarah Ferris is the most wonderful person in the world, and she lives in London. She's a Kiwi who was influenced, I think, by the Christchurch shooting in her homeland and other things. And we met by happenstance on a joint Zoom call over a whole other issue of whether or not we wanted to join a different platform as podcasters. And they had that platform had called me and said, we want you to do a podcast. And I was like, yeah, I don't have time for that. And I'm not really interested in what is a podcast? You know, I mean, that kind of, like, no. So, but she met me on that call and she kept in touch with me. And she said, we should do a podcast together. And she lives in London. She was raising 3 teens at the time. And I live in the States. And we'd have conversations. And I think she came very quickly, because she's so smart, she came to realize that the things that I know, I just kind of took for granted that everybody knew because of my narrow little world I lived in. And that's really kind of where it kind of went from there, because she called and called and called. And I was like, okay, fine. So then we came up with this concept of doing this podcast called Stop the Killing that focused on, we started the first season looking at an incident and then saying, I don't talk about shooters. I don't use shooters' names. I don't know the name of a guy who shot up this place or that place by choice. I mean, I purposely don't want to give any light to somebody who's done this, but we can learn about what we know about that person, what led up to it, because targeted violence, which all of these mass shootings, active shooters are, active shooters are all targeted violence. Targeted violence is a planned event. And the podcast gave me an opportunity to explain to Sarah and hopefully to the public. We have had a lot of, I'm astonished at the listener response in support of it and the comments that we've gotten. I'll tell you one thing at the end maybe, but it gave me an opportunity to say active shooters, people who go into communities and schools and malls and shoot people up, that is a planned, targeted, violent act. And if you know the signs, we can find the shooters before they shoot. Let's talk about the signs that we saw on this particular incident. Who might have seen those signs? Did they report them? Didn't they report them? What could you look for next time? And would you report it? Because some of the conversations that I've had with Sarah, we would talk about an incident and I'd say, okay, here are the things that this shooter had. He had this characteristic. He did this act, this act, this act, this act. And I'd say, would you have called police and reported that? And sometimes she would say, no, I don't. I don't think that's my business, or I don't know if that's suspicious. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. So we talk about how important it is to report what you see that's atypical behavior. And the podcast really delves into that in a way that, you can't do that on a news interview, or you can't do that, in a news story in print. And certainly it's the same kind of stuff that's in my book, but now we've applied it to actual cases where we can say this occurred. And I'll tell you, just as an example, some of the kind of things that are the Stop the Killing book. I call it the red book because the cover's red. But in the red book, Stop the Killing, it's all data driven. There's no politics in any. I'm not writing politics. I'm writing let's save lives. So it's all data driven. What does the research show? What do we know in this case? What do we know in that case? And I had, as an FBI agent running that program for 5 years, access to material nobody else had access to, right? I mean, I had every bit of it. That's all I did every day. So unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff in my head about this, and I can really draw from big perspectives. And one of the advantages too that I had is, running that program, I could go to our behavioral experts, what people call profilers in Quantico, and get them to join in. And I had them take these police reports from our study and of 160 active shooters. And I said, go through these police reports. I want to know what we can find out about these shooters. And so because of that, the FBI behavioral people, it took them a few years, but they produced the first ever, only ever analysis of 60 plus active shooters, real shooters, what we knew about them ahead of time from the police reports, which generally is not public information, right? From the police reports and what they knew ahead of time, what people knew ahead of time when they knew it. And we came up with this extraordinary amount of information and data that is all detailed in my book, in the red book. Just as an example, one of those pieces of information is that our study showed middle school and high school kids, 6th grade through 12th grade, they shoot up their own schools. So your shooter's already inside the school. What are you doing to take care of the mental health and the welfare of the children and the students in your school? Because your shooter's already there. No metal detector is going to protect your classroom, right? That's part of the issue, right? Your shooter's already there. But more astonishing, the behavioral aspect, the Quantico people found out for me that of those shooters they studied, 92% of the school student shooters told a friend or more about the shooting before it happened.
That's high.
92%. Mm-hmm. That's called leakage. People know ahead of time. They see things and they hear things. We need to continue to push to train people to understand what you see, what you hear, and then to be an upstander. And if you see something, say something. That is the crux of the problem that we have when it comes to firearms violence, this type of firearms violence in the United States.
So you still have that relationship with the FBI then as well?
Yeah, it's important. I think the FBI above all taught me, and the FBI has always believed from its inception that they can only do their job with the support of the American people, and you just can't. I mean, the FBI has 30-some thousand employees, and the United States has 300 plus million people. So we know from that research, I told you 92% of the students told somebody about it. But when it comes to who else heard leakage and who else saw signs, 75% of the time, or 78% or 82%, all these family members, spouses, coworkers, teachers saw things that were noted, things that were unusual conduct for this individual, not like after the fact, things that they were so concerned about, they mentioned it to other people. But so 75% of the time, people saw these concerning behaviors and they didn't necessarily report them. Law enforcement only sees disturbing behaviors 25% of the time. By the time that law enforcement gets there, it might be too late. If the first time we're seeing some subject is when he's raising a gun in the school and we're raising a gun back to him, then as a society, we haven't done a good enough job of taking care of that person who's broken. Because people have real or perceived injuries, and in their mind, they've got some grievance, whether it's real or not, and they have tried to resolve it another way. In their mind, they say, I tried to resolve it. When we interview shooters who live to tell about it, they'll say, they made me do this. Those people in that business made me do this because they did X, Y, Z. In their mind, Other people had opportunities to prevent the shooting, and they only did the shooting because they needed to. I think that a lot of times I do hear people say they give excuses. We all give excuses. They say, I don't want to tell. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. I don't want to get involved. He says things like that all the time. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I don't really know what that means. I mean, it's just a weird thing for him to say. Like, it's weird for him to say, no one's going to be at school the last week of school. That's kind of weird for him to say, but I don't really know what that means. But what that means to me is that you are making excuses for why you don't want to share that information with somebody who might be able to add more pieces of information together. It's always a big puzzle. And you carry that as one piece of puzzle, just report it, get it off your shoulders and report it. That's what you need to do. And we've seen many successes when they do that. But I think that when I talk to kids, I'll say, telling is getting somebody in trouble, right? If you want to tell on somebody, when I talk to kids, I say, if you want to snitch, snitching is getting somebody in trouble. If you want to tell somebody about something, you're trying to get them help. So when you try to get somebody help, that's what you want to think about is let's get that person help.
Yeah. So what's next for you? Where are you seeing yourself going?
So this month, come hell or high water, I'm finishing my fun book, and I hope to get that out to publishers for consideration. I think it's a pretty fascinating book about something amazing. 200 dead people, 200 murdered people. So I'm working on that book, and then I'm going to write a book for parents. I think parents need a book. They need a little easy book to understand what is it that parents can do. What are their biggest fears, and how can we educate them? So I'm going to hopefully have a parent book out by a small, nothing, no big heavy lifting, but a smaller book that they can read that will give them good resources and good ideas about what their priorities should be. So there's that. And also I'm gonna do more visiting. I'm gonna do a little more traveling. And I had hoped to be in Scotland in September, but I don't think I'm gonna make it there. So I have to make some other plans. Darn it. I know. I'm coming. It's happening. It might be December or January, but I'm coming.
You're coming.
What's your weather like in December? Scary?
Cold.
Hey, I'm from Michigan. I do cold.
You'll be fine, Lynn. You'll love it.
Mm-hmm. Hey, the tourist level will be low.
Yeah.
We'll get great. We'll be able to get great seats at the pub.
You will. You'll be the only ones at the pub.
I'm okay with that. So that's kind of, where I am. Where I'll be next year, I don't know. I think we're going to keep working on the podcast because we think it's important. And I will say this year when I was thinking maybe we just can't keep doing this podcast, we don't have the sponsors. I'm hesitant to ask anybody to sponsor and whether it's as an advertiser or a Patreon, and I always feel awkward doing that. So I don't have great sponsors, for the podcast, and that would be really nice. We just do it all because we think it's important, but it grinds away at your time and your hours. Sarah does all the engineering herself. I do all the research, and we kind of split it up that way. And I mean, it would be wonderful, in case anybody's listening, it would be really wonderful to have somebody sponsor our podcast. But I think everybody who does a podcast feels that way. But I will say this past year when I was thinking, oh, we just can't keep doing this anymore. We got a call. We got a message through Insta, I think, first and then we talked to a person who is a vice principal of a middle school, which would be like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids. And she said, I wanted to tell you, all right, I'm going to try to say this without tearing up. She said, we wanted to tell you that I'm an avid listener to your podcast, and I make my teachers listen to it too. And everything that you were teaching us came together recently when we stopped a shooting at our school.
Wow.
They had compose yourself, Kate. They had a 12 or a 13-year-old boy who'd been planning a school shooting for 2 years at their school. And had told other classmates about it, had been talking about it. And they had the circumstance where another student heard some information, told her mom, the mom called the school right away. This person who had listened, all these people who had listened to our podcast knew what to do right away. And so they stopped a shooting.
That is amazing. That's something to be proud of. It's definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, then you think you don't know what impact you can have. And so that makes me think, okay,
Yeah.
we just have to find time and keep doing this because it's important.
It is important.
So that's why I'm here in the town where I grew up in, doing the Josh Hawley show and the morning show. They gave me a mug.
Oh, wow.
I'm so excited.
Oh,
On JTV. I know, they're fancy. They got mugs. And giving me a mug and doing an interview and sharing what I know, with the people in the town I grew up in. That's why I happen to be here in this studio doing the podcast from here.
Fantastic.
So my mission continues.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it'll continue until we stop the killing.